Welcome back to How to Fix Democracy. In our fifth series, we're focusing on the history of American democracy in the last 100 years. We're up to the period just after the Second World War, the Cold War, and all the complexity of issues that are associated with the post-war age. We've had some shows on the history of American progressivism and on the left. We haven't really focused, though, on the history, or perhaps the lack of history, of American conservatism on the American right. One man who spent his career thinking, writing, observing American conservatism is our guest today, Jacob Heilbrunn. He is the editor of the National Interest and the author of a couple of really interesting books. One on neoconservatism and one which is about to come out, a history of America's conservative love affair with authoritarianism. Jacob, welcome to How to Fix Democracy.
Thank you, Andrew.
So let's turn the clocks back, Jacob, to 1945. What was the state of American conservatism as the Second World War ended?
Not good. The first thing that the American conservatives did, there was an interesting congressman named Frank Bateman Keefe from Wisconsin, who on May 16th, the war had ended on May 8th, denounced one of his colleagues named Adolph Sabath for having referenced an army fact sheet on fascism that had been created for American soldiers that were headed to Germany. And this fact sheet was a fairly anodyne document warning that you wouldn't necessarily recognize a fascist if you saw him, that fascists didn't announce themselves, and in those general terms. How did American conservatives construe it? They denounced it as a demagogic document, one that they said had been composed by, quote, totalitarian liberals, unquote, in the Roosevelt administration. The conservatives were opposed to American entry in World War II. They remained opposed to it, a number of them, after World War II, and in fact, not only denounced Roosevelt and then Truman as traitors, but also went out of their way to palliate Nazi war crimes and to argue, Senator Joseph McCarthy was a leading proponent, that America had been no less guilty of war crimes in World War II than Nazi Germany.
But are you associating Joseph McCarthy with the mainstream of American conservatism? Wasn't he a rather paranoid extremist?
Absolutely not. He was the most powerful American conservative. He was the leading figure on the right for a number of years, and even Secretary of State George Marshall was attacked by him. Eisenhower was reluctant to defend Marshall in an appearance in Wisconsin during the 1952 campaign. Joseph McCarthy terrorized the Republican Party the same way that Donald Trump terrorizes it today. He is the genealogical ancestor of Donald Trump. Trump has just figured out how to do it even more effectively, and he doesn't suffer from some of McCarthy's personal problems, including drunkenness.
We'll come to Trump later in the conversation, Jacob. But in terms of an interpretation of American history, there were three Republican presidents, of course, in the 20s, and then you had FDR. What was the standard narrative, both in terms of what happened in America in the interwar period and the Second World War? What was the standard narrative on the right?
Well, after World War II, the right, led by Regnery Press, which remains active today and is influential on the right, published a number of books which are consonant with what I was talking about earlier, arguing they published, I think, about almost close to 10 books in the late 40s, early 50s, arguing that either America shouldn't have entered World War II or that we, in fact, were guilty of war crimes. There was one woman who was close to McCarthy named Frida Utley who wrote a book denouncing World War II and arguing that we were just as guilty as the Germans. And that was picked up by McCarthy. I don't mean to dwell on him too much, but McCarthy's first action as a senator was to dispute that American soldiers had been gunned down by an SS division at Malmedy. And McCarthy argued that the Jewish lawyers had behaved in a reprehensible manner toward these German soldiers who had massacred Americans. And there was a committee hearing in the Senate, and ultimately the Army was exonerated. But again, it shows you the kind of tactics then that we see now, the demagoguery and the smearing that we saw then and we see it today.
What, Jacob, was the standard critique of FDR? Was he considered by many conservatives as a communist? And indeed, perhaps their hostility to FDR came out in the hysteria about communism after the Second World War?
He was certainly seen as a dictator, as a potential dictator. He was seen as someone who had enabled Jews to enter the government, and that these Jews were subversive, including Felix Frankfurter, who he pointed to the Supreme Court. They called him all kinds of names. So FDR was seen perhaps not as a communist himself, but as an enabler. And that was a very prominent theme in the mid to late 1930s. There was open anti-Semitism on the right in America, including, I don't mean to get too far into the weeds, but there was a general who retired in 1938 named George Van Horn Mosley, who testified before Congress and also denounced Roosevelt, denounced Jews, called for the sterilization of any Jews entering the United States from Europe. There was another businessman in New York who I talk about quite a bit in the book named Merwin K. Hart, who was also explicitly anti-Semitic and pro-fascist, anti-democracy. All of these people were agitating before World War II and after World War II against what they saw as subversive communists in the government. Essentially, they believed there was a deep state of totalitarian liberals who were destroying America.
Was there any truth to that?
No. I mean, if you look at what FDR did, what are we talking about? This man went to war against Nazism. What on earth? To revile Roosevelt, who saved American democracy. When you look back at this, it's almost incomprehensible. Unfortunately, that ethos seems to have lingered on down to the present. But what is, if you want someone who was anti-communist, Harry S. Truman devised the Truman Doctrine. Yet they assail Roosevelt and Truman as traitors to America. They invert reality.
Jacob, you've written a very well-received book on the neocons, on neoconservatism. What about the history of neoliberalism and the Hayekian response to Keynesianism, which came to define at least one side of conservatism in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s? What was the state of thinking about economics at the end of the Second World War? Was much of the critique of the New Deal and FDR a kind of proto-Hayekian critique?
Yes, the conservatives after World War II continued to condemn the New Deal as itself a totalitarian project because they believed it was stifling free enterprise. and that you had welfare programs established, Social Security. All of this was creating what conservatives like to call an omnicompetent state. And the man who managed to sand down the hostility to the New Deal was actually William F. Buckley Jr. In 1952, he writes a piece calling for a rapprochement with the big state, because in order to battle communism, you need to have a strong, vigorous military and a national security state. So the shift comes in the early 50s and is engineered by William F. Buckley, much to the distress of the old guard conservative movement.
In your new book, America Last, Jacob, you talk about conservative America's long-abiding love affair with authoritarianism. But wouldn't it be fair to say of McCarthy and even the more paranoid American right that there was a deep hostility to the authoritarianism of Joseph Stalin and then later of Mao Zedong?
Definitely. And it's interesting, the China lobby that emerged after World War II was what allowed conservatives to jettison their earlier isolationism. But as I try to point out in the book, though they embraced conflict with China and wanted to roll back the communist advance, the rise of communism in China, they also created a hagiography around Chiang Kai-shek, who was also a corrupt authoritarian leader, who they valorized, the same way that they valorized Francisco Franco in Spain. And interestingly enough, William F. Buckley and the National Review cohort all praised Franco in the 50s and 60s.
And even Mussolini, perhaps.
Mussolini is a different case. That was in the 30s.
But had Hitler not existed, they perhaps might have been a little more sympathetic to Mussolini.
They were sympathetic to both. William Randolph Hearst, there was Harding had appointed an ambassador named Richard Washburn Child, who was there when Mussolini conducted his march on Rome, and he became one of the most ardent proponents of Mussolini in America. One reviewer called him Mussolini's vicar. There were a lot on the right who were extremely sympathetic to both Mussolini and Hitler as authoritarian leaders who could get things done. And that's what we needed in the United States as well.
Was there, in your view, in the history of American conservatism since the Second World War, even beforehand, this split between the free market people who idealized the notion of capitalism and economic freedom, and then those nostalgic for the authoritarianism of Mussolini or Franco or other anti-democratic leaders, or do they go together?
There really wasn't, and it is a paradox. I just pointed out in the book that it begins actually with World War I, when you had figures like H.L. Mencken, who revered Kaiser Wilhelm. But Mencken and others, Albert J. Nock, who was a mentor to William F. Buckley, they were all libertarians. They were suspicious of the state, yet at the same time, they worshipped the Prussian bureaucracy. So I haven't been able to figure out how they reconcile that in their own minds. I think ultimately the lure of authoritarianism trumps everything for them. The idea at bottom is anti-democratic. From Mencken down to William F. Buckley, you have a mob, a rabble. Why are these people allowed to vote? They don't know what they're doing.
Jacob, you mentioned Buckley and Mencken. Mencken, of course, was notable for his comments about Jews. Maybe he was an anti-Semite. I'm not sure on Buckley, but of course, how much of what you're talking about in the rise and the cult of authoritarianism and hostility to democracy in American conservatism was bound up in the unique American narrative about race?
A lot. I talk in the beginning about The Great Gatsby, the famous passage where Tom Buchanan, who's a Yale graduate and former football star and represents old money, starts bellowing to Nick Carraway and the others about how he suddenly read this book. Now, Tom Buchanan doesn't really read books, so it's pretty distinctive that he's latched onto this. And he says, have you heard about this book by this man, Goddard, that's talking about how we're going to have the decline, the colored peoples are all going to rise, and it's going to be the end of the whites. And so he's essentially voicing WASP anxiety, that he's going to be toppled from the apex of the social pyramid. And Goddard was actually a man named Lothrop Stoddard in the 1920s, who was a prominent advocate of eugenics and was pro-Hitler, as I point out in the book, and was a key figure actually in the Senate and the Congress passing the Johnson-Reed 1924 Act, Immigration Act, which essentially it cut off all Asian immigration and only permitted immigration in essence from Northern Europe. They wanted to establish what they called Nordic supremacy. And that lasted through the 1960s. So race is key in here. It's key in the 1950s too. National Review under William F. Buckley in 1957 argues that no, blacks should not be allowed to vote. Buckley then, after having written that editorial, amends his position in the 1960s, and he says the uneducated generally should not be allowed to vote. So again, you see there's a racial and anti-democratic ethos here. No accident, by the way, that the National Review and many conservatives consistently defended South African apartheid in the 1950s because they thought it was a better system than what we had in the United States. You should not allow black people to vote. Decolonization in Africa is a mistake. They will run riot against their white masters. And that comes right back to Lothrop Stoddard, who actually wrote a book about Haiti and the rebellion against the French, which he saw as an example when there was a black uprising and they slaughtered the whites. He's like, hey, this could happen to all of us. We need to be careful.
You could make the same argument, though, about Winston Churchill, who had never really been accused of being anti-democracy. I mean, he obviously isn't American. Often seen as the bulwark against fascism and communism in Europe.
Certainly, Churchill had his vulnerable spots. Conservative writers like to defend him on India. I think there's a lot that's not defensible. Churchill was a product of the Victorian era, so those views were deeply embedded in him. But I don't think that they vitiate his innate sense of the danger posed by Nazism and Hitler. He had an instinctive understanding of it, and who did not was a good chunk of the British aristocracy, as you know, was in fact sympathetic to Nazism.
Including the royal family.
Yes.
Let's fast forward to the 60s and the moment when mainstream republicanism became more mainstream politically in America. Barry Goldwater first, and then Nixon, and then of course Reagan. How does this fit in to your narrative? Were Goldwater and Reagan in particular, maybe Nixon is sui generis, but are they individuals who secretly or not so secretly fetishized authoritarianism?
There's no question. In the case of Goldwater, I'm not quite as convinced. In Nixon's case, certainly, both he and Kissinger, I don't think they viewed foreign despots as a model for the United States. And I think it was filtered somewhat more in realpolitik terms, that they enjoyed working with leaders that they could trust and who had command of their populations and weren't subject to the gusts of the vicissitudes of a democracy. And hence, look at the example of Chile. where Kissinger and Nixon behaved quite badly.
And that's where your two wings of the Republican Party, the neocons or the neoliberals, the Friedmanite wing and perhaps the authoritarian wing come together in the Chile chapter.
Yes, and even more in the 1980s over, I focus on Jeane Kirkpatrick, who defended a number of the more odious regimes in Central and South America. But as I point out in the book, Kirkpatrick, who was a leading neocon, went even further than her peers were prepared to tolerate. She actively schemed to promote the Argentine invasion of the Falklands, and that caused an uproar in the Reagan administration. But she did outlast Alexander Haig, who was her bête noire in the Reagan administration.
Speaking of Reagan, some of his critics suggest that he was authoritarianism with a sunny face, that he made jokes, but ultimately, if you pare it all away, all the jokes, all the making fun of himself, he was an authoritarian leader, which was most clearly manifested as governor of California and his treatment of what happened there, particularly on campuses in the 60s. How does Reagan come out of your narrative?
I talk about Reagan primarily in the context of the support for Jonas Savimbi, who was leading an insurgency in Angola called UNITA, and became a figure of cult worship here in Washington. Reagan, I think, did make a shift. I think the administration itself made a shift with the Philippines, with the ouster of Ferdinand Marcos. I do not see Reagan as similar to Trump or some of the other authoritarian figures. He began his career as a New Deal liberal. He didn't really immerse himself in conservatism until the 1950s when he started working for GE and reading up on conservative economic tracts like from Henry Hazlitt. I've always thought that Reagan was actually in some ways a conservative version of FDR. This sunny optimism that and the faith in America that he projected is actually Rooseveltian. And I don't think that he was a hater the way that the more modern conservatives have turned into. I think, and Reagan was not anti-immigrant, for example. He did not share a lot of the obsessions that you're hearing now.
Jacob, one of the things that FDR and Reagan clearly have in common was their mastery of the media. Might it be said that when you don't master the media, when you don't have the genius of an FDR with his radio presentations or Reagan's genius on television and film, it lends itself to a sneaking love of authoritarianism?
In what sense?
In the sense that you can't get to people's hearts by making clever speeches. So the alternative to that is to shut down the institutions of democracy to get your own way.
No, I don't think that holds up if you look at Trump, because he is a genius at branding and has formed this umbilical cord with his followers who seem ready who were ready even to storm Congress on his behalf. I think Trump is very much in the popular demagogue vein and has the kind of speaking abilities, for example, that Joe Biden does not.
Let's get to Trump in a second, but of course between Reagan and Trump there is 30 years, history of the Republican Party, history of conservatism. How do we summarize that history in terms of your thesis of conservatives' long, not always open love affair with authoritarianism? What happened between the Clinton years and the rise of Trump?
I'll borrow a German phrase, the long march through the institutions, which was formulated by Rudi Dutschke in the 1960s. After the Cold War ends, what does Patrick Buchanan do? He writes a piece in the national interest called America First, Second, and Third. He says, the Allies are moochers, we need to return to isolationist policies. He's anti-immigrant, World War II was a mistake. He holds the flame aloft. And Buchanan is viewed as a sort of a fringe figure in the 1990s. He does speak at the convention in 1992 in Houston, the Republican convention, where he lays out some of this. But in retrospect, Buchanan kept this flame alive and handed the torch to Donald Trump. And you have this movement which coexists inside the GOP. It never seems like it's going to take off until they find a horse that they can ride, which turned out to be Trump. So all of these things that Patrick Buchanan represented, anti-immigrant, anti-World War II, anti-alliance, anti-NATO, and by the way, Buchanan extols Vladimir Putin as a great white Christian leader who has no truck with gay rights in Russia and stands for his nation. So it's all there, and it's picked up by Trump. I never would have believed at the time that you would find such receptivity to these ideas. But unfortunately, they've proven to be far more durable than I or many others would have anticipated.
How much of it, though, is a response to the failure of American foreign policy and perhaps even domestic policy under the Bushes, the failures of the various wars in the Middle East, this shift to isolationism? It's not just the cult of leadership, is it?
No. There's no reason it should be. The pivotal moment for Trump in 2016 was in the South Carolina primary when he denounced Jeb Bush and said that the Iraq War was based on a lie. And a good chunk of the audience booed him, but he was able to capitalize on the growing disquiet among conservatives for foreign intervention.
But wasn't there some truth in that? The left and the right agree on that the Iraq War was based on a lie.
Correct. And Trump was the first to voice it in the Republican Party. That was his genius.
Let's take a mainstream Republican like Mitch McConnell. I'm not sure if he has a heart, but if he had one and we can get to it, what would we discover when it comes to the issues that you're discussing, this shift from democracy to authoritarianism within the Republican Party?
Certainly, McConnell has been an enabler. I don't think that he consciously thought that it would end up in the hands, that his project would end up in the hands of a demagogue. I think he had more of a Federalist Society conception and a business, corporate republicanism. That's what he stands for. In essence, what he did is being hijacked. He stacked the Supreme Court, he stacked the federal judiciary. All of this was just waiting there. And the beneficiary of this is going to be Trump, if he wins, and McConnell will be sidelined. Christopher Browning in the New York Review of Books once called McConnell the Franz von Papen of the United States, by which he meant Papen was vice chancellor in Hitler's January 30th, 1933 cabinet. His assistants were murdered in 1934, in the Night of the Long Knives, and von Papen was shuttled off. There's always someone more radical than you waiting to seize the reins of power.
Jacob, in all seriousness, a lot of people have juxtaposed two visions of America in the 21st century. The multicultural vision of blacks and browns and whites united together with a belief in democracy, and an increasingly white, reactionary, backward-looking America. Do you subscribe to those two alternatives? And is that second category, the backward-looking white America, is that the America that has fallen back in love with authoritarianism?
I think that the assessment of white America is correct, that it exists on grievance and anger and the desire to lash out at people who are rising. And this could take us into a whole deep conversation about anti-Semitism A friend of mine recently wrote a book about anti-Semitism in Central Europe in the 19th century, arguing that it was in fact, however reprehensible, it was not an irrational reaction because the Jews were rising. So those who weren't doing as well came to resent them, and that manifested itself in a very ugly politics. Maybe we're seeing something of the same here. Is the vaunted Democratic coalition what you refer to as the black, brown, white coalition? No, what's interesting is it's going to be much trickier for the Democrats because Hispanics apparently do not view themselves as part of this, and the Republican Party has the ability to attract some of these voters. So the story is more complicated.
But one narrative is that white America knows it can't win because it doesn't have the votes. So it's either going to shut the show down or cheat. Is that an alternative narrative to your argument in America Last, that there's this long love affair with authoritarianism? After all, the white Republican Party is deeply hostile to China and Xi, who it positions as some sort of Stalinist.
Right, and I think I point out in the book that this Asia First policy existed in the early 1950s. It's come back today. So I don't see a lot of distinctions. I guess the fundamental point maybe that I haven't made yet is that there are no new arguments on the Republican or I should say conservative side, that all of these arguments that they're making today have been made for 100 years. So I don't think there's anything new about it. I don't think there's anything original. And yes, I do think that a chunk of white America today is not only trying to rig the system, but already has. At the state level, we're already existing in some of these places in a semi-Hungarian style democracy, where the options are limited with gerrymandering and other tactics that they're using. And we saw the attempt in Wisconsin to stifle democracy there as well.
So America, it's no surprise that American conservatives spend more and more time in Budapest studying the Orban model.
Not only studying, but Ron DeSantis has hosted top Hungarian officials in Florida. And the Heritage Foundation, about a month ago, had a meeting again with Hungarian officials to strategize on how to block Ukraine aid in the American Congress.
Perhaps DeSantis should have checked with Orban about how to win a primary when he can't get any votes.
Well, he was going up against an Orban-like figure, or even more.
Well, speaking of that Orban-like figure, Donald Trump, how does he fit in? You said nothing much has changed. Trump was a celebrity television star. There was no celebrity television in the 1920s or 30s. But of course there were Huey Longs. How new or old is Trump in terms of this America first or last model? Is there anything unusual about him, or is he just a type?
I think he's simply regurgitating arguments that have been circulating for 100 years. I'm not sure that he's aware of their provenance, but he does come from Queens, and he does have this basic ethnic view of the world. And he has glommed onto these arguments. Perhaps they were handed down to him by his father, who we know attended a Ku Klux Klan rally in New York. I think he's conveying the attitudes that he's soaked up at the dinner table. I mean, he has been very consistent on these demonizing racial minorities. And he's also actually been consistent in foreign policy. He did an interview with Playboy in the 1990s, I believe, or maybe even earlier, in which he denounced NATO and these other countries as socialist moochers who weren't contributing, and we were getting taken for a ride by Japan and Germany. So no, I don't think Trump has a skill at creating slogans, but even the America First slogan, as you know, dates back to World War I. So I do not see Trump as an inventive genius.
What are the 20th century models for replicating Trump? I was recently in Baton Rouge in Louisiana. I visited the state house where Huey Long was assassinated. Was Huey Long a failed version of Trump? An assassinated version, a bloody version?
Certainly FDR feared him, and he did represent a potent threat. Yeah, Huey Long was a populist demagogue. And those characters are quite pervasive in American history. I was thinking about earlier today, even in Huckleberry Finn, for example, Mark Twain offers a quite pungent description of the attitude of the lower white class, Huck Finn's father, and the venomous hatred, again, towards black people and someone that's doing better than you are. So whether it's Huey Long or Trump, no, I don't see much distinction.
A historian at Trinity College in Connecticut, Jacob, has just written a book about how the foundations of American history are bound up in blood and violence. And he writes obviously about slavery and also about the mass murder of indigenous Americans. In terms of your thesis in America Last and this long love affair on the right with authoritarianism, how much could it be traced back to the very foundations of American history, even before the wars of independence?
That takes you into very tricky territory. I do think that the Founding Fathers had universalist aspirations. It was not a country founded on race or ethnicity. I mean, that was not the governing aim. And I think you had the ability to transcend what was in the Constitution at the time. So I'm a little wary of a one-dimensional history of the United States. I don't think it was simply forged. It was also a commercial nation. It wasn't simply that it lurched from war to war.
A lot of people have talked about a specific kind of American fascism. Is that what, in a sense, you're writing about in your new book, America Last, and this narrative from Huey Long to Donald Trump?
No, because I think the American aspects of it, I suppose you could argue, are but even the fervor with which they enunciated. I mean, you had Mussolini and Hitler were, of course, also demagogues. And I think that the Americans, they looked abroad to these people as models. So they tried to import these doctrines. And that's what they're trying to do today with Vladimir Putin and Viktor Orban. So I don't think that I don't think there's a unique American tradition here.
We're speaking in late January 2024. Jacob, it's hard to know what will happen in the next few months. But do you believe, given your thesis and given your coverage, that Trump and Trump's Republican Party represent an existential threat to American democracy?
I do. I think Trump has already proven to be a dire threat on January 6th, and that he would have exulted had his Vice President Mike Pence been hanged. I don't think he would have batted an eyelash, and he was actually urging the mob on. So to put this man back into power when he now has a much better understanding of how the government works, he has a cadre of followers, including at the Heritage Foundation, who have devised this Project 2025 to eviscerate the federal bureaucracy. I do think that Trump would come into office. I think after about a year, he would ignore the Supreme Court. He would
When you say ignore, what does that mean?
They were already in Texas. You see 25 governors saying that Texas doesn't have to abide by the Supreme Court ruling right now on allowing the federal government access to the territory that's being held by the National Guard in Texas. So you're starting to see extra constitutionalism. Trump would decapitate the CIA and the Defense Department, Joint Chiefs of Staff. It would take, it's not like you can do this overnight. But he would come in there on the first day. I'm sure he would lock down the border. He's talking about putting up concentration camps on the border. He's talking about going after illegal immigrants in the United States and putting them in these camps. I don't think he's telling you what he's going to do. No one's concocting this, inventing this, putting words in his mouth. He's telling you.
He is telling us. He's not shy to articulate that, and in a rather boastful way. And yet he's getting the huge support of the Republican Party, which makes up around half of Americans. Are Americans falling out of love with democracy? It's all very well focusing on leaders, but there are many voters who seem to share Trump's cult of authoritarianism and hostility to democracy. How do you make sense of that?
Perhaps we've been telling ourselves a fairy tale about American democracy for decades, and that this national unifying myth is starting to crumble. The caution, of course, is that this Trump faction does not represent a majority of Americans. Represents attitudes that have been percolating for a long time. And it also is an argument that I thought about in the context of Germany as well. It shows why you need taboos in society. And you do need certain social norms enforced. And right now, things are fraying. You need to establish a new consensus. You need to fight back.
What everyone thinks of Joe Biden, even his biggest admirers, would probably acknowledge that he's not a man of enormous vitality and perhaps a little too old. Is there a broader problem, not just on the right, but on the left of American democracy? That the Democratic Party, for example, is not able to come up with inspirational figures, younger, more vital and vibrant people able to somehow appeal to the country's imagination as FDR did?
I totally disagree. You have a number of governors, Gretchen Whitmer, Gavin Newsom. They would all be running if Biden wasn't running for a second term. If Donald Trump wasn't running for a second term, or for a second term as president, I don't think Biden himself would probably be running. You have a strange situation. Let's not extrapolate too much from the present. That's also dangerous. Things can change radically. And for all we know, someone like Gavin Newsom, or that there's a new wave. Also, if you look at the younger generation in America, they tend to be more liberal than the president is, and there's a push for change. Also, the issue of Israel is changing in the United States. So this society is susceptible to change and even lurches. There's no reason that it can't go in a positive direction as well.
Final question, Jacob. If what you're warning about, Trump coming to power, shutting down democracy, if that happens, what are we losing?
We are losing all the progress, or much of the progress that this country made in the 20th century, both in attempting, however awkwardly, to promote democracy around the world. It would be catastrophic for our relations with Europe. We went to war twice in Europe. We have established NATO. We have the dollar as the world's reserve currency. We have the United Nations. However, none of these things are working perfectly. But Trump would he would take us back to a pre-World War II situation where it's every nation against every nation. That's how he views the world. And the Biden approach, or the approach that we've taken most presidents since World War II, is to try and cooperate with our allies. I think it would have gravely injurious effects, not just to American democracy, but also to the economy. We would probably plunge into a new depression.
What about for the Americans who say we're already in that depression? I'm struggling to put food on the table of my kids. My kids can't afford college. It's harder and harder to get more than minimum wage work.
That, I think, has been improving. The economy is bouncing back. So I don't buy this negativity. And I don't think it's seeped through to the population, or it's starting to. But I actually think Biden's done a tremendous job on the economy, including investing in the economy, which the Republicans, by the way, tried to stop.
Well, Jacob Heilbrunn, I hope you're right. I know that you think that Biden's going to win the election because certainly if your critique of Trump, of shutting the whole American democracy thing down, it wouldn't be good for this show. I don't know what we would talk about. But thank you so much for coming on the show, and best of luck with your fascinating new book, America Last.
Thank you.